Today's topic is male infertility with Georgi Dinknov. We are going to be talking about why there's been such a decline in male infertility throughout the years and what you can do about it. Make sure you stick around to the end where Sarah and I kind of ramble, but provide our own insights and wrap up discussion about action items and main takeaways for improving male infertility. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today, we are joined again with our friend Georgi, and we are talking all about male fertility. So Georgi sent us a few articles before starting the podcast, and one of the most alarming statistics that he sent was close to 50% of young couples are infertile or have a hard time conceiving and having children. That just doesn't seem natural. Like our biology wasn't designed to have a 50% failure rate of conceiving. No. So in today's podcast, we're going to discuss with Georgi kind of the stats, the facts, reasons for poor male fertility, and some of the things that you males can do to improve your fertility, because males are 50% of the picture. So
that's right.
Males got to get their shit together.
That's right.
So I agree. Georgi, what are some of the facts and the alarming statistics behind the male infertility crisis?
So some of the first signs we're seeing actually in the mid 70s, some urologists started raising the alarm that they're seeing a lot of people with subnormal or they call less than normal, less than optimal testosterone levels. But for a long time, the medical profession refused to recognize that testosterone, other than being the aggression hormone, which actually turns out to be a lie. Turns out that men with high testosterone are not aggressive, they're actually calm, assertive, and capable capable of stopping aggression. Estrogen is the hormone behind aggression. But those early alarms that were being raised were usually dismissed with the expression of like, oh, so what? We're going to have males with lower testosterone. It's better for society. We're going to have less crime, right? Well, it turns out that testosterone is actually very important for male fertility because the sperm count and the sperm motility is directly controlled by not just the absolute amounts of testosterone a male produces, but by the androgen to the estrogen ratio. And since testosterone is the dominant androgen in males, you can actually kind of approximate that by the testosterone to the estrogen ratio in males. And that ratio has been precipitously dropping since the 1970s. The studies that I showed you, as scary as they are, they only look at half of the picture. They're looking at the decline of the testosterone levels, and that decline basically is in the range of 30 to 40% since 1973. Sperm count is down more than 60%, 60, since 1973. And actually, the study that I sent you, the period that they looked at was 1973 2011. So we have another 12 years on top of that, and the trends that I sent you on the other articles are that this is continuing. So by now, we'll probably have 70 to 80% decline in sperm count, and probably 60 to 70%, 60 to 70 decline in testosterone levels. And these things go in parallel, which perfectly corroborates the original hypothesis of that urologist in the 1970s who said, hey, declining testosterone levels in males are alarming. This is not going to end well, right? We need to do something about it. And that guy was dismissed. He was told, just go about your business. We're going to have less aggressive males. Like, who doesn't want that, right? Well, it turns out that nobody wants that, including the women. Nobody wants to be. I don't want to say that there's a stereotypical role of the male, but I think a calm, assertive, strong, capable male is something that most heterosexual females would like. A male that sits around and whines all day and is always in touch with their feelings and just whining about everything all the time, which is what low testosterone does do, because it allows estrogen to run unopposed, is something that most people would not want to be, right? The male will probably not want it themselves to be that way, and the females will not want to be around such a male. So, but that's the situation we have right now. And then that last link that I sent you, which is kind of the scariest that I've seen so far, because usually if you Google around, say what percentage of couples cannot get pregnant these days, the mass media will give you a percentage between 1 in 5 to 1 in 4, so 20 to 25%. But if you look at the official link, which is from a study on PubMed, and actually this is the article published on NIH's website, National Institutes of Health, so government official data, in a very nefarious way, twist the wording around, but you can actually calculate yourself, saying 40 to 60%, 40 to 60% of young couples can are capable of getting pregnant naturally. So the average of 40 and 60 is 50. That's another way of saying 50% cannot get naturally pregnant without artificial help, which is in vitro, some kind of fertility stimulating drug, such as, by the way, the fertility stimulating components are also very dangerous themselves, like clomiphene, which is what women get pumped full of. But even in that case, usually the focus is on the woman, right? It's like, okay, even though it could be a male infertility, the way they're treating it is saying, like, oh, as long as you have one viable sperm, we're going to like turn your partner, female partner, into a ridiculously fertile goddess, and even this one viable sperm will be able to fertilize her, to impregnate her, right? But they're not doing anything for the male part, and the reason is they're saying they don't know what to do, right? They're saying we don't know what's causing the decline in male fertility. Well, there's plenty of literature published saying that the decline of testosterone levels is the primary cause. Combined, which is something that's not being talked about, is the also rise of estrogen levels, because that's what happens when testosterone levels decline, or at the very least, when the testosterone to estrogen ratio declines, the male will be in a so-called estrogen, a relative estrogenic dominance. And that is really, really, detrimental to male fertility. In fact, back in the day, sexual offenders in some countries to this day are given the choice: you go to jail, male sexual offenders, or you undergo chemical castration, which is done by injecting them with either estrogen and or a synthetic progestin, and they actually measure their sperm count and the testosterone levels, and they continue with these treatments until these things are down in the drain, which is where they are naturally for most males in Western societies. So estrogen is very, very bad for male fertility. It's actually very bad for female fertility as well, but it's less talked about. It does have a role in ovulation, and basically medicine kind of latches onto that to say that estrogen is the female hormone. It's absolutely crucial. Without estrogen, you cannot get pregnant. That is not true. In fact, progesterone is the pregnancy hormone, and progesterone is what's given to women who are pregnant in order to maintain the baby. You give them too much estrogen, they abort. So again, back to male infertility, declining testosterone levels and combined with rising estrogen levels, and on top of that, there's a rise, of course, of the exposure to endocrine disruptors, which are everywhere around us. Some of them are synthetic, especially coming from plastics, and kind of like a byproduct of the chemical and the petrochemical industry. But some of them are actually natural. And the natural ones, even though most people don't think of them as endocrine disruptors, are the polyunsaturated fats. No matter what we talk about, this comes down to the polyunsaturated fats, and people say, no, you're just you're a fanboy for saturated fats. You just keep bashing the PUFA. What does PUFA have to do with infertility? Well, there is a component in one PUFA oil called Gossipol, Gossypol, and it's a component of cottonseed oil, but also several other seed oils. And if you look at it, it's been studied over the last 20 years as a male infertility pill. So there's a naturally present sterilizing agent in several of these seed oils that are being sold on the market. Now, since the public kind of got a wind of that, the presence of that infertility agent, I think now they're starting to filtering it out. But several studies that I posted on my blog over the last couple of years demonstrated that just the pure polyunsaturated fat by themselves, when they're fed to a pregnant woman, can basically produce an infertile male offspring. If the woman eats a lot of PUFA during pregnancy, and if they're given in a sufficiently high amounts to regular healthy males, whether children or adults, they're going to render them infertile. The problem is that with prolonged consumption, the polyunsaturated fats can actually damage structurally the gonads and may potentially cause partially irreversible infertility. Estrogen works in the exact same way, and it's not a coincidence. The polyunsaturated fats and estrogen very largely overlap in terms of their physiological effects in the male organism. So that's really the cause. And of course, the stress that everybody's experiencing. And stress is kind of known to have, like, at least indirect link to infertility in medical circles. They know that males who are chronically depressed have a much higher rate of infertility than the general population. But of course, then the actual mechanism of action is considered unknown, just as you found, right? We don't know what to do about it because the cause is unknown. Well, when you're depressed, your cortisol and your serotonin are high, so is estrogen, and every single one of these is actually an infertility agent in both males and females. If you give the multiple studies showing that if you give cortisol to males or females, the females never go into ovulation. They never produce a viable egg. If you give cortisol to males, their testosterone levels plummet. They start getting fat. They lose interest in not only females but even food. And basically, they just become like semi-dead blobs of fat running around, not really interested in anything. So it reminds you of anybody? The infamous couch potato phenotype. That's actually a male who is either chronically stressed, or he's fed on high polyunsaturated fat diet, or he's taking a serotonergic antidepressant, or is bathing all day in endocrine disruptors. And unfortunately, for most males, it's a combination of one or more of these factors. So it's really no surprise that we're here. In fact, I'm surprised that the percentage is not even higher, which kind of tells me that the population that we're seeing, fertility-wise, things have kind of almost split the way we're seeing politically. You have a population that lives like in the heartland of the country. They're more traditional, more in touch with nature, more intuitive, more trying to eat, more the way their ancestors did. And you have the, coastal cities and other large urban centers where basically, technocracy rules, and the males there are being decimated, and the females too. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's a paradise for females there, but both males and females are being decimated by a combination of extremely crappy diet, endocrine disruptors, chronic stress, right? Almost unescapable, because if you live in a city and that's your whole life, where are you gonna go? You feel like you can't even survive out in the sticks. So that's the combination of these things, and we're seeing 50-50, and that's pretty much how the country is split right now. Half of the country is in the cities, half of the country is out in the heartland, and these two sides are irreconcilable with each other politically, and now, as you can see, physiologically as well. It's just the way things are going. The technocratic lifestyle kind of really blurs the lines between males and females. It's not a coincidence that most of transgenderism is seen in the big cities. A lot of people say, no, it's because it's tolerated there. It's not only tolerated there more, it's actually the environment there is more conducive to producing it. Most people will say that people with transgender tendencies are born this way, but multiple studies going back to the 1960s have demonstrated clinically, you pick an animal model, there is an established protocol for inducing transgenderism or sex ambiguity, and even homosexual behavior. All of these things are actually known to be chemically inducible in animals. Now, a lot of people will counter that by saying, well, we don't know how much of this translates to people, but if it happens, if it works in mice, if it works in rats, if it works in pigs, works in rabbits, and works in monkeys, then to me, this is proven. It works in humans until proven otherwise. So that's where we're at. Basically, the male has been decimated, and I know that's a very politically correct statement to say, because all we hear on media is that more power to women. I agree, more power to women, but it shouldn't be by decimating the male. These men and women need each other. If you decimate the male, I don't think the females will do very well either.
Yeah, so the studies that you sent, I think it's important for people to remember that when you perform a study where you're analyzing like previous years, you can't study like current year data. It's in the past. And so these statistics that Georgi said, this is from like 2000 up to 2010, up to 2012. Yeah. We are now a decade past that, and things are probably getting much worse. But you don't see these things happening with animals, right? Like on our farm, we don't talk about 50% failure in them producing babies. Like it's just natural, and it's happening because we're not interfering with the natural biological processes. Whereas now in America, you see these just alarming rates. So for a young couple, for the male, what would be like the best blood work to assess his fertility, I guess?
Oh, very simple. I mean, total testosterone, not free. I emphasize total testosterone, because that is the metric of how well the gonads are working. And usually, basically, most of these males that are infertile, the reason they have low testosterone is because there is something called secondary hypogonadism. In other words, they have low testosterone, but in the context of functioning testicles, right? For some reason, testicles are not producing as much testosterone as they should be, and that's a combination of dietary factors and endocrine disruptors and stress, as I mentioned. The testicles are fine for now. Actually, it's a big caution for now. If this continues, they may actually structurally start to deteriorate. But so total testosterone test, I would say testing for estradiol is probably not a bad idea, and this will allow to calculate the testosterone to the estrogen ratio. It needs to be at least 50 to 1, 50 to 1. So testosterone needs to be at least 50 times higher than the estradiol on the blood test. Prolactin is a very good one, and in fact, back in the day, the anti-prolactin drugs used to be have been used and continue to be used off-label as treatment for both male and female infertility, which tells you that there is a common factor. And that common factor, prolactin, being, it actually goes hand in hand with estrogen. If you have high prolactin, then your estrogen is elevated, even if it does not show up as elevated on blood tests. And a lot of people say, "Well, how come I have normal estrogen in my blood on my blood result, and then my prolactin is high?" That guarantees that the estrogen inside of the cells is actually higher than normal. You cannot have high prolactin without having an elevated intracellular estrogen. And conversely, the antiprolactin drugs are very good fertility drugs for both males and females. Cholesterol levels, basically, if they're above the 200 mark, chances are that the male is hypometabolic. And the amount of testosterone you produce is directly controlled by your metabolic rate. It's not a coincidence that males with aging start to get puffy and chubby, and they get the beer gut, the infamous beer gut and whatnot. This coincides and the low testosterone levels. This coincides perfectly with a decline in the metabolic rate of the male. Same with the female, but they deposit the fat differently. They use usually around the thighs and around the breast area. But it's just a symptom of declining metabolic rate, which can be measured by the amount of cholesterol in your blood. If cholesterol rises, chances are that basically your metabolic rate is declining, and since cholesterol is the precursor to testosterone and all other steroids, but testosterone being the important one for males, then you're not going to be producing as much testosterone as you really need. What else? I mean, I think carbon dioxide is also a good measure for metabolic rate. Vitamin D is a very good one. Even though most people think of vitamin D as a bone kind of vitamin/hormone. It is actually very, very important for fertility, and multiple studies, intervention studies, have demonstrated that giving males between 5 to 8,000 units of vitamin D daily can eliminate about 30 to 40% of the infertility in that specific group. So you can slash that infertility by half just by giving people vitamin D. What does vitamin D have to do with fertility? Well, it looks like the vitamin D, because of its structure, it's actually a steroid, or partially broken steroid. The Latin name is corticosteroid. Is capable of activating some of the same enzymes and pathways that testosterone does. So you can think of vitamin D as acting as a testosterone mimetic into the male body and as a progesterone in the female body. But it also stimulates the synthesis of more testosterone. And since vitamin D levels are basically one of the best indicators of both sun exposure and metabolic rate, low vitamin D levels are yet another indicator of how well the metabolic rate is functioning in that male. Ultimately, all health problems stem from low metabolic rate, and all of these endocrine disruptors are basically shutting down this male's metabolic rate. And one of the first things that a body does when metabolism is not going well is sacrifice, quote unquote, the physiological functions that are considered luxurious, which reproduction is one of them. Basically, the body says, "Well, my job now is to keep you alive, so you can forget about having babies." And it's not a coincidence that when a male is stressed, sick, etc., and has low testosterone levels, there is less sexual desire. This is nothing abnormal about that, and the body's basically saying, "You can't even get this woman pregnant. Forget about taking care of this kid. So I'm going to, keep you depressed and slow you down until your health improves." This is a natural physiological response to a suboptimal environment. And we're seeing it, again, emphasize, we're seeing it mostly in the urbanized environment. There's something about urban living over the last 50 years that has happened, because it wasn't the case before. That has basically resulted in very bad, conditions for the male fertility. By the way, I know this episode is about the male fertility, but if you look at the statistics, the infertility causes, infertile couple are about 50-50 male-female. So female fertility is decimated as well. And there's something in the urban living that seems to be causing that. And I think, based on what I've seen from the studies, is, again, a combination of stress, endocrine disruptors, and poor diet, which contains itself a lot of endocrine disruptors as well.
So when you say endocrine disruptors, what would be the main sources there for people to look out for?
But mostly plastics, some benign things such as toilet paper, paper towels. Receipts from the store have the highest amount per square inch of endocrine disruptors, higher than even plastic. And I know people's like, why? Well, because the paper that is being produced, they're trying to make a paper that's more resilient to degradation from water and just generally tearing it up, right? So they apparently there is a decent amount of plastic or some kind of other kind of a plastic derivative, and the bisphenols, which are basically these components, these chemical structures that contain two phenyl rings, and estrogen is a very similar component, contains a phenyl ring. So these things are ubiquitous in nature, and they're usually highly present in plants. One reason, probably why most people should be careful about eating raw vegetables, mostly vegetables at present, because these things were designed to actually deter most organisms from eating the plants. Plant doesn't want to get eaten. Plant wants to grow up and make babies and spread those babies, right? So they want to deter pesky, aliens like us from eating them, and they do with these endocrine disruptors, which mess with your digestion, with your endocrine system, and there should be a signal to a healthy, intuitive animal that, well, I don't want to eat that. Only the herbivores have the necessary machinery to actually kind of overcome that, and happens to do with the tricamera stomach and the bacteria that's there, but we're not. So if we eat vegetables at all, they should be very, very well cooked. But this destroys most of the naturally occurring endocrine disruptors, which are based on these phenol molecules. Resveratrol is a very common one, and that can be destroyed by cooking. But the synthetic ones that are coming from plastics, they're usually very resistant to heat. And unfortunately, the only way to degrade them, the only study that I've seen about degrading them, is by increasing the metabolic rate. There's something about increasing the metabolic rate in both males and females that allows the organism to conjugate these molecules that are stored mostly in the fat tissue and excrete them. And the more you excrete them, basically, the more your natural health will get restored.
So basically, these endocrine disruptors, they're kind of acting to ultimately raise the estrogen levels both inside the blood and also stored in the tissues of these males.
Yeah. Much more nefarious than that. They're acting as thyroid antagonists. So they actually work in a way directly opposite to the thyroid hormone. So they're directly lowering your metabolic rate. They're also acting as estrogen receptor agonists. So they're perfectly mimicking the effects of estrogen, even if you didn't have estrogen. And it's like you're getting an estrogen in a pill, but it is much more potent. And that's why some of the doctors that I've talked to are saying, oh no, if females were hyperestrogenic, we would have seen this on blood tests, but most of them actually have, sometimes even have low estrogen levels. So I say, yeah, that's what happens when you ingest a synthetic estrogen from the outside, because your body says, oh my God, I have a lot of estrogen because this thing works like estrogen. So the response is to scale down your own estrogen production. And on blood tests, sometimes you'll show up with low estrogen, right? And that's why I said originally for males, you can have low estrogen in blood and still be very, very hyperestrogenic. And the way you check it is by prolactin. If there is something in the body that acts like estrogen, prolactin will rise. So if prolactin is high, you are hyperestrogenic, period. And the secondary test, the estrogen levels in the blood is less reliable. You shouldn't really rely on it. You should rely on the prolactin. When you ingest these endocrine disruptors, prolactin rises in both males and females, and it's an anti-fertility factor in both sexes.
What's some other estrogenic sources for males, like deodorant?
By the way, the endocrine disruptors are also anti-androgenic, which is another bane for males, because the activation of the androgen receptor is necessary for developing a lot of the secondary sexual male characteristics that make us attractive to heterosexual females. They're not going to grow facial hair, which is now ubiquitous. I mean, there's an entire multi-billion-dollar industry coming up with these ridiculous toxic sprays to make males grow facial hair because their testosterone levels are low, and they're seeing, okay, women don't like without hair, so what am I supposed to do? Well, the reason is you have an endocrine problem. You don't change it, you don't fix it by applying a spray. Maybe it'll work temporarily, but the way it works, if you look at most of these sprays, they contain some kind of a synthetic androgen. So another corroboration to the fact that the males are getting basically whatever is happening in this environment, it acts very in an anti-male fashion. And by the way, anti-female as well. It's because estrogen, even though it's kind of necessary for sexual function and ovulation in females, if you give it too much, females become masculinized, and I think that's another thing we've been seeing in the urban populations. Very, very feminized men and very, very masculinized women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw a study that showed that polyester garments or underwear actually completely obliterated male fertility.
There you go.
So that's just another source right on an important area of your body.
Yep.
So plastic clothing,
Plastic
plastic water
clothing,
bottles.
carpets, like they're full of these flame retardants, which almost
Oh, yeah.
universally are carcinogenic and estrogenic. Carcinogenism and estrogenism go hand in hand. Not many people know, but in 2001, I'll send you the link. NIH, again, the official government, declared estrogen a known human carcinogen. In this situation, I don't have any idea how any doctor can push with good conscience, maybe because they don't know or they don't care. Oh, to females, here is this pill, take it, for as birth control. So, by the way, the females taking birth control pills, a lot of which contain estrogen, rubs off on the male. Like, when they're having sex and there's a contact down there, basically, if the female is hyperestrogenic, she's leaking these synthetic estrogens that she's been taking by the pill, or the synthetic progestins, many of which are also estrogenic, but they're definitely anti-androgenic as well. That affects the male as well. Not to mention the attraction part. Have you seen the studies that when females basically get on the pill, they like a specific type of male, and then they get together and they stop the pill because they want to have babies, and suddenly the female finds the male no longer attractive and they break up or they get into physical fights. There's like plenty of studies on that. Basically, now basically the gynecologists are kind of trying to advise women, find a male without being on the pill, right? And then get on the pill. If you're on the pill and he finds a partner, there's a good chance that if you get off the pill, there's going to be a clash there, or at least you're not going to find that partner as attractive as before.
Yeah.
But don't get on the
We,
pill.
we did
But
a
yes,
no, we did a poll on our Instagram story about that specific study to see if anybody who was following us had that experience. And I would say it was over 50% of the people who had found a partner when they were on birth control actually for either for a long period of time was not sexually attracted to this person,
yep,
or they ended up having to end the relationship
yeah.
because the state that they were in when they were off the pill was so different than what when they were on it.
Every single steroid is known to have a neurosteroid action. If you type neurosteroids in Google, you get the Wikipedia page, and every single one listed there is also a sex hormone. So what your hormones are, what you take, and what you're exposed to the environment, and the way you change your endocrine profile determines almost completely your sexual preference and the specific type of person you'll be attracted to from the opposite sex or the same sex if you actually have gotten that exposed to endocrine disruptors.
Another one in the environment would be exposure to mold.
Yes,
I've read a lot that it actually mimics estrogen in your body as well.
yes,
So that's going to be stored into your tissues. And overall, when we're talking about all these different endocrine disruptors, they're hindering the metabolic rate. And I think that any exposure to something that's toxic like that is going to push you further and further into a hypometabolic state, which is almost like this negative domino effect.
hmm,
Whereas if you start peeling back these layers and reduce your exposure and increase your metabolism and maybe do a few additional detoxification remedies, that is likely going to be enough to move you in the right direction.
yep,
Yeah, it seems like step one is reducing your exposure because Georgia, you mentioned that a higher metabolic rate leads to improved detoxification of these
yes,
things. But
yes.
I feel like for many people, we are exposed to such high levels that the high toxic exposure to estrogen and estrogenic chemicals is actually one of the things that's holding back our metabolic rate. So it's like this like you
Yeah.
said,
It's
like
a
this
catch
negative
22. You
effect.
have to get out of
Yeah,
stress to get out of stress, right?
yeah,
Remember
it's
what I told
hard.
you? Finding somebody who you're in love with and run away in the forest for a month. I stand by that statement. You wanna get detoxed. Go away to like a completely wild wilderness area, preferably with somebody you're like and you're attracted to. Sit there, do your happy thing for a month, and you're not gonna want to come back. Or if you come back, you'll be just like these people who went off the birth control and be like, I don't want this environment. There's something inherently toxic about it.
No, that's a very valid suggestion. Ashley and I are very deep into like the mold toxicity thing, and so
Hmm.
that is a common thing for people to have to do. Is they are suggested to move away from their environment for a period of time to see if they actually just start getting better on their own, and it's likely because we're moving somewhere cleaner, maybe more sun, more
Yep.
fresh air, and that is a very big change in the right direction for somebody to go through.
Yeah, there is a lot of yeast. Like, let's say you go to a particular part of like the country where there's a lot of food is produced with specific kind of yeast. Some people are so sensitive to eat because estrogen plays a big role into the growth of molds, yeast, and generally other kinds of like fungi. So a lot of the commercial food contains a specific kind of yeast, but the type of yeast depends on the area of the country where you are. And I know people who basically can eat a specific kind of bread in one part of the country. The exact same kind of bread bought in another part of the country just doesn't sit well with them. So changing the environment for a month, and I think Dr. Pete mentioned that to some people who said that, I've tried everything and nothing works. And like he said, well, maybe your cocoon, the where you are right now, the combination of things is like too much of a toxic combination to kind of try to tease apart. Why don't you get out of town for a few weeks? And usually things improve to the point where when you go back, you kind of intuitively sense that I have to go back, but I know it's not good for me. And if that happens, then I think it's a good indication for whoever can afford it to change something drastically. Work location, living location, type of diet, potentially even partner, because they can contribute a lot to your toxic lifestyle.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to consider that, unlike mainstream medicine, which views every body part as a silo, so I'm sure someone in mainstream medicine is going to say like, oh, there's just something wrong with your genitals. Like that's the reason why. But under the bioenergetic view, the body works as a system. And so the internal state of your body impacts the hormone production, and the hormone production impacts how the body runs as a system.
Yep.
So in your recommendation for someone who is just really in the wrong direction, so they are just extremely estrogen dominant, extremely stressed out, low fertility, are there any beneficial supplements that you would recommend in addition to obviously reducing your plastic exposure, cleaning up your diet? But are there any supplements that can help you get kickstarted in the right direction?
Yeah. But with the caveat that if fertility improves and this person now manages to have a child, keep in mind that unless your health improves as well, you're not going to be a very good parent. I mean, things can deteriorate just as quickly as they got better. So fixing the fertility, you should view fertility, or low fertility in this case, as a sign that something is really not well functioning in your life, which is driving down the metabolic rate. And in your case, or at least for now, the fertility is just the first symptom of these things going wrong, right? Down the road could be something else. You can get a heart attack, God forbid, or like a digestion problem, or some other endocrine problem. So things need to change. But with that in mind, I mean, some very simple things. I've seen people who are completely, and there was a male fertility, infertility in this case. Basically, the doctor said, "Oh, your testosterone level is 350. By the way, the lower limit of normal is 300." And to put this into perspective, back to the studies in the 1970s, 800, which is now the upper limit of normal, was actually the average. So the doctor said, "No, nothing's wrong with you. You're actually in range. So we're gonna, pump your wife full of clomiphene. We're gonna try to do like a artificial intrauterine insemination, I think they call it. So they, get the sperm from the male, try to eliminate all the dead sperm, right, and remain only the viable ones, and then inject them into the woman and try to get her pregnant." None of that worked. 5 tries. And then I said, "Well, why don't you try some aspirin and a little bit of vitamin E?" And he did. And by the way, I asked him to retest, and his testosterone went up to the 500 limit. By the way, I'm not mentioning this by chance. I'll explain in a minute why. And then they got pregnant. But this person realized that something is definitely not going well with their life. So after the baby was born, they picked up and they went back they were living closer to the grandparents on both sides. And now with less stress, with a new baby, grandparents are helping out. They're happy. Everybody's happy. Less stress. So basically, the testosterone levels in the male were in the 500 when the woman got pregnant, and now they're in the 700. And the reason I say 500 is that I'll send you the study, but basically showed that no male with a total testosterone level below 500 in the study that was tested was able to naturally create a baby. No male. And 500, basically, if you go to the doctor and you score the 500, the doctor will probably shake your hand and will say, "Bye, man, you're good. You can impregnate a brick." But if you look at the actual averages across the United States, 500 is actually, the doctor will be right because those are the averages within the United States. But if you break it down by state, and if you look at basically where the most fertile men are, they are in the mountains in the Midwest, and a little bit to the south. Nothing on both sides, on both on both coasts. They're over there. They're in the 300s. So 500, I'll send you the study. No male, and it was like 300 of some different males randomly selected, so it is statistically significant. No male with a total testosterone under 500 was able to become naturally a father, even with the stimulation of the female. So yeah, aspirin, vitamin E. Another factor also known to help males, and that was tested extensively in the early 20th century as part of the vitamin E test is something called the polycotinols. And I think we discussed this in regards to feeding them to chickens because it increases the egg yield of the chicken. But if you look at those studies, it also made the chickens, both male and female, more fertile. The chickens produce more eggs, and the male roosters produce more sperm. So basically, it was a fertility factor, and that was tested back in the early 20th century, and they attributed most of the fertility to the vitamin E, because what they tested in the early 20th century was wheat germ oil. But it turns out that it wasn't the wheat germ oil, it was the fraction of the wheat germ oil containing vitamin E and the polycotinols, key portion, because after vitamin E was isolated, they redid some of these studies, and although vitamin E was very helpful, it did not fully replicate the increase in fertility produced by wheat germ oil. But when they added the polycosanol, so the combination of vitamin E and polycosanol basically acted almost like a very potent either anti-estrogen or an androgen like testosterone. And invariably, when they fed the male animals the vitamin E and or the polycosanol, their total testosterone levels rose. What else? I mean, if people are willing to, vitamin D, as I mentioned, right, or often something as low as 5,000 units, even though that's not considered low by general standards, it is actually kind of low. A recent study came out saying that the RDAs that the FDA came up with are probably underestimated by a factor of at least 10. So if the RDA published by the FDA says that you should get 400 units of vitamin D daily, what it really means you should get at least 4,000. Which kind of corroborates that study, which showed that if you give males 5,000 units of vitamin D daily, another one did 8,000, basically their testosterone levels almost double, and fertility in the males improves. And then these are probably the most benign things that can people find in most stores. Things like gelatin are also very strong pro-fertility effect, probably mostly due to its anti-inflammatory effect. A lot of these salts that are seen around us, ultimately, the way they cause the downing of the metabolic rate other than endocrine factors, that they're all pro-inflammatory. Like if you get a mold, is pro-inflammatory. Endotoxin is pro-inflammatory. The polyunsaturated fats are pro-inflammatory. Anything you get inside of your system that the body does not like, it will cause an immune reaction, and the part of the immune reaction is triggering the inflammatory response. Chronic low-grade inflammation is known to actually be a reliable infertility causal factor, and it was actually there was a proposal, I think back in the 1980s, to create a male infertility injection which consisted of nothing but the prostaglandins. And the prostaglandins are these highly pro-inflammatory molecules which aspirin inhibits, by the way, probably why it helps with one reason why it helps with male infertility, and they're derived from the polyunsaturated fats. So something as benign as chronic low-grade inflammation can make the male fully infertile, even probably in the presence of normal testosterone levels, by the way, but those usually decline when there's a chronic inflammation present. So anti-inflammatory drugs are likely to help, have been shown to help, not just aspirin, but aspirin is probably the most benign of them. Ibuprofen is actually known to have anabolic effects, not just pro-fertility, even in males as old as in their 90s. And it turns out that inflammation is a very big factor in frailty and infertility in males, so they give these males an anti-inflammatory drug, their inflammation declined, their testosterone levels, increase, and they started chasing the grandmas again.
Okay, so when it comes to actually binding with things in the body to help get rid of them, so for the process of removing these things, these toxins from our body, where do you see binders? Like I know Dr. AP typically would just recommend activated charcoal.
Yes.
Where do you see that coming in?
The charcoal will mostly help by preventing their absorption from the food, if they're present in the food, into the bloodstream. After they're already into your body, basically, several studies looked at what can actually chelate these things. And it looks like the reactive oxygen species that we produce as part of our normal metabolic rate can actually destroy or at least deactivate these endocrine disruptors. So just making the metabolic rate higher will actually would destroy many of these endocrine disruptors while they're still in the tissues, and the rest can actually be more effectively excreted by the liver, because as the tissue turnover increases, the old cells that die and rupture, they spill their kind of entrails into the bloodstream, and then these things will circulate, and a lot of them will end up in the liver. And with a good metabolic rate, a well-functioning liver will be able to attach something called glucuronic acid or sulfate group to these lipid-soluble endocrine disruptors, which a lot of them are, especially the plastic-derived ones, and then you excrete them more easily through the urine.
So I think what we've discussed so far is kind of the one side of the equation, which is kind of reducing toxin exposure, reducing inflammation. And then on the flip side, in parallel, we should be working on improving our metabolic rate.
Yes.
And so I think there's some people in the health and wellness space that say that males and females are different because
Mm-hmm.
females work on a monthly cycle, males are on a 24-hour cycle. And so males are a little bit more resilient to some lifestyle behaviors like fasting and keto and low carb, and ice baths and these type of things. Can you briefly touch on how like lifestyle behaviors, how that's playing into cortisol versus improving or lowering the metabolic rate?
I don't think it's true that males are more resilient. It entirely depends on the endocrine balance. The last podcast with Dr. Soldino, we actually spoke about this, and specifically in regards to fasting. He said, "What do you think about fasting?" I said, "You need to do the blood check for several hormones, specifically cortisol and DHEA." And several studies have already shown that the cortisol to DHE ratio is the best predictor of all-cause mortality and future morbidity. In other words, no matter what disease you're going to get into the future or what you die from, can be almost entirely predicted by the cortisol to DHEA ratio. And you want that to be as low as possible. In other words, cortisol should not run unopposed. DHEA is the one of the protective factors. So the reason I'm saying males are not more resilient is that if you get a male with a suboptimal cortisol to DHEA ratio, they will not be resilient to even like a 3-hour fast. They start shaking, they start getting jittery, even aggressive, to the point of violent aggression as well. So really, the whole resilience thing comes down to your endocrine balance and your metabolic rate. I know women who basically do hard physical work all day because they work on a farm. I mean, they can probably arm wrestle 99% of the males that are around me here in the city, and and not just give them a good run for the money, but basically win 9 out of 10 times. You'll be I don't know, if you come to the city, DC specifically, you'll be appalled at the males that are walking around here. Did you see that article from about the testosterone levels of the journalists that work at BuzzFeed? So it's been like a popular talk. You can Google it. It's been a popular talking point among conservatives that the soy boys that live in the cities, they're really not males at all. But it used to be an anecdote up until recently, and then the 3 or 4 males from BuzzFeed said, "Well, let's actually check because we feel like alpha males." So then when they checked their testosterone levels, I think 3 of the 5 or the 4 were actually hypogonadal. Their testosterone levels were actually below the lower limit of normal. One guy was in the 300s. So soy boys down to the last one. And if you look at the comments behind underneath the article, they're like, yeah, you can tell by looking at them. Not a single one of them has facial hair. Not a single one of them has any muscle, any sign of muscle on their body. Some of them, basically, they what's it called? Oh, only one of them has ever been in the gym and lifted weights. Nobody even knows what a farm looks like. Anyways, long story short, yeah.
Sounds like Bill Gates.
Yes, sounds like Bill Gates. Yes, yeah. Well, and it's not surprising that people like Bill Gates push the kind of things that we're seeing lately. The low testosterone in males can get them to do some crazy things, much crazier than there's a stereotype of the crazy old woman. Men can be crazier. If their testosterone levels drop sufficiently. In fact, males produce more testosterone in their later years than a woman does. It's not a coincidence that if you look at very, very old like couples, the males look very, very feminized, and the women kind of look masculinized, or at least ambiguous, right? That's not a coincidence. After andropause, and it's not just menopause that exists, but andropause as well, after the male testosterone levels decline below the 500 mark, and the estrogen levels are always rising with age because it always rises with inflammation, aging, low metabolic rate, etc. Once that crucial ratio of testosterone to estrogen drops below the 50 mark, you're basically getting endocrinologically, you're getting a woman, or at least a very feminized male, if you can even consider that.
Wow.
So basically, these kind of fasting, keto, it kind of depends on your stress bucket. And
Absolutely. On your sort of like the reserves that you have, and the adrenal reserves and the thyroid reserves. If you're a young, healthy, high testosterone male, you can probably weather like a week-long fast. But if you're an older person, especially with some extra weight, these fasts are not going to do you any good. Look at that study that on the show, The Biggest Loser. What an aptly named show. So these people lost a lot of them, the ones that won, they lost all of their weight through like a grueling program of exercise and fasting and whatnot. And then basically after they were done, some of them ended up in the hospital because it was so stressful. Some of them became diabetic out of the fasting. That's definitely should be a wake up call for many people. But every single one that came out of the hospital, most of them were males, not only regained their weight, but they overshoot it by about 25 to 30%. So they really shot themselves in the foot. They decimated their metabolic rate, and their testosterone levels were even lower than when they started. And those people do not weather fasting well. I mean, like I said, many of them ended up in the hospital. And I mean, in general, you don't hear of somebody doing a fast that ended up in the hospital, right? So it really depends on how resilient you are. I don't know people over the age of 50 who can handle well a fast longer than 24 hours. It just doesn't sit well with them, and they, feel like they're gonna pass out, or they get really like jittery and agitated and angry. So it's not something to be trifled with. Everything is fun and like one of my friends says, like everything is fun and games until you're 60 and none of your children talks to you and you cannot walk anymore or get out of the door because of chronic arthritis. So don't play tricks, don't play stupid games with your body, because you'll pay the price later.
Yeah.
So what would you say is the main reason that this population cannot tolerate doing, let's for say example, longer than a 24-hour fast? Is it the elevated cortisol?
Probably most likely to cortisol and the endocrine disruptors, because if you raise estrogen actually increases the production of cortisol even in the absence of stress. One of the reasons why a lot of women that are used to be on purely estrogenic birth control, but the classic stereotypical the hysterical woman in the office, and everybody's saying, oh, is it that time of the month yet? Except it's happening every day. Well, what could be causing that? And it's estrogen, because it's an neuroexcitotoxin. That's well known, and also increases the production of cortisol. That cortisol cannot be turned off until the estrogen levels decline. Typically, cortisol has a pulsatile rhythm. It's higher in the morning and it's lower in the afternoon. It starts rising again in the evening. It's been shown that women who are on the pill, especially if it contains estrogen, they have a flat rhythm. And the flat rhythm is always higher than what the optimal real is. It's about 2 times higher. So when your cortisol is chronically elevated, you cannot relax. And just people with high cortisol, they're always hyper, they're always wired, and it raises sufficiently high, they become manic. So I would say chronic stress combined with the fact that most people do this, and subconsciously they feel like they have no way out. So the learned helplessness kicks in as well. And it's the depression, most of the depression cases really are hypercortisolemia. There's a drug which was marketed as an abortion pill, which it is, and now it's in the news for different reasons for the abortion, but it was designed as the cortisol blocker. Its name is RU486, also known as mifepristone. So they basically gave they gave women with clinical depression that was not treatable by anything else. They gave these women mifepristone, and I think there were some males in the study as well, a rapid relief of depression within 24 hours. So it kind of shows you that for a large majority probably of the cases, depression is nothing but a symptom of chronic inescapable stress.
Wow. So when you think about estrogen dominance, is there any correlation between being overweight
Yeah.
and this situation?
Yes, absolutely. The more fat cells you have, because they have the highest concentration of the enzyme called aromatase. So the more fat you have, with more fat cells you have, the more estrogen you will be producing. Now, this is bad in itself, but if you're also under chronic stress, then a lot of that fat will spill into the bloodstream, and since most of it is PUFA, the PUFA can also activate the stress response, while saturated fat blocks it, or at least can turn it off. The PUFA can stimulate the aromatase enzyme even more, so you're producing more estrogen. The PUFA can actually stimulate the cortisol production, even in the absence of the pituitary sending a stress signal. So it's the fat, it gets you about 50% to the place where you really screwed up. The other 50 is chronic stress, because you can never relax, and as long as your bloodstream is flooded with fats, most of which are very bad for your health, fertility specifically, but also in general, for your health, then you really cannot get out of this. The stress has to stop in order for the lipolysis, which is the supply of fat from the tissues to the bloodstream, goes back to baseline. If that does not happen, your health will not improve, no matter what you do. Elevated lipolysis is now known to be even the driver of the final stages of cancer, the cachexia, which is the wasting, which is what we know people with advanced cancer to have, and it's what kills about 90% of cancer patients. The other 10% are being killed by the drugs themselves, but 90% of the patients are being killed by the wasting response, which is the cachexia, and that is now known to be triggered by excessive lipolysis. In other words, chronic stress, oversupply of fat, and the cells can never relax in the situation. They can never recover their metabolic rate.
Okay, then, Georgi, now we're at this weird position where a lot of people are overweight,
Mhm.
have excess estrogen,
Mhm.
and they do need to lose weight to improve metabolic rate, but
Yep.
the act of losing weight will increase lipolysis.
Not
So what do they
necessarily.
do?
You can raise your metabolic rate without actually doing the lipolysis by taking pro-metabolic substances. Aspirin is one of them. It actually, in higher doses, aspirin works identically to the old weight loss drug, which is still very effective, unfortunately banned by the FDA, called dinitrophenol. And if you look at the early, kind of like a weight loss crazes that were really came from Hollywood in the 1940s and the 1950s, almost nobody at that time dieted. They all took drugs. And to this day, elite athletes almost never diet because they know it messes up with their metabolic rate. So they take drugs or they take some kind of a chemical substance that will help them lose weight. So dinitrophenol raises your metabolic rate. It is your heat production, and basically most of the calories that you consume are, kind of like wasted away as heat. You don't store them. Aspirin does the same thing, but you have to take significantly high doses. But even without that, in the lower doses, it acts as an aromatase inhibitor. So it's going to prevent and stop some of the stress reaction that's causing this fat to go into your from your tissues to your bloodstream and poison all of your tissues and create this chronic stress response, which is on top of the stress from the outside, right? Aspirin also inhibits the enzyme, or at least the metabolite of aspirin, salicylic acid, inhibits the enzyme that synthesizes cortisol. So just in one pill, you have basically something that reduces the excess, not too much, but this is the excessive estrogen and the excessive cortisol, which are known to be behind obesity. Recent study I'll send you, which demonstrated that an anti-estrogen drug was fully reversed the weight gain that occurred in females after menopause. So now we know that estrogen is actually causing the fattening of the women, even though the official version is no, women get fat after menopause because they have deficiency of estrogen. The exact opposite, actually. They have an excessive estrogen, but it's stored in the tissues. Vitamin E, estrogen antagonist. Vitamin E inhibits the synthesis of these pro-inflammatory mediators, the prostaglandins, which are infertility factors for males, and also pro-obesity for both males and females, and activate the enzyme aromatase. Vitamin E is itself an aromatase inhibitor and also acts as an antagonist directly at the estrogen receptor. And then, if people are willing to experiment with steroids, the ones that are over the counter, such as pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA, all three of them have anti-cortisol and anti-estrogenic effects. Gotta be careful with DHEA because you can convert to estrogen if you take too much. But in that study that showed that blocking estrogen reversed the obesity of menopause, they also demonstrated that giving DHEA to these animals also reverse the weight gain. So these are pro-youthfulness hormones, and you produce a lot of them when you're young, but the production declines when actually with aging, and that's probably one of the reasons we're gaining weight and we're becoming infertile with age, with decline of the production of these youthful hormones.
So I think just to summarize that discussion, we need to make sure that we're doing weight loss in a way that's improving the internal environment of our body and improving the metabolic rate, or
Yes.
we could get results such as The Biggest Loser, because
Yeah.
those extreme efforts done by those overweight people in The Biggest Loser, that came at the cost of a reduction in their metabolic rate, which backfired in the end. So we want to make sure that we're supporting our metabolic rate, which can be measured by our body temperature and pulse
Exactly.
throughout the day, supporting that as we are on our health and weight loss journey.
And doing as much of, let's say, concentric exercise, because that's what builds muscle. The reason these people in The Biggest Loser ended up where they are is because they indiscriminately fasted and did exhaustive exercise, which basically ended up losing most of their lean tissue. They also lost some fat, right? But they ended up in the situation that medicine calls sarcopenic obesity. So they lost, sarcopenia means loss of muscle mass, and obesity, which means, of course, that you still have the fat. So they ended up skinny fat, right? So they lost a lot of weight, but they lost mostly the wrong kind of weight, which is the lean muscle mass, which is what determines your basal metabolic rate. Thyroid and lean muscle mass control metabolic rate. The best way to build lean muscle mass is concentric exercise, which means contraction of the muscle with a load. But when it relaxes, it should be without a load. In other words, if you're doing bicep curls, you curl with the weight, but then you drop the weight. I know it sounds dangerous, but for a lot of exercise it is. But deadlift, you can probably lift it and then drop it. I know a lot of people do that, right? Climbing stairs, pushing heavy things around the farm. I don't know, you load something on a cart and you have to move it half a mile. That's actually probably one of the best exercises you can do because it activates almost every single muscle group, but it's almost purely concentric.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So we're big proponents of obviously lifting weights, so increasing your muscle mass, and I feel like that might help in general with just improved body composition, maybe reduction of fat.
Yep.
You mentioned something about the estrogen receptors.
Yeah.
So I understand like when you lose weight, you might reduce the amount you have. Is that true?
Both the amount of estrogen you produce and the amount of estrogen receptors, which is what estrogen activates to achieve its effects. So you really, you kill two birds with one stone. And also, when you are doing concentric exercises, the muscles themselves become factories for producing testosterone in males and progesterone and DHA in women. Those are the protective steroids. So whenever you strain your muscles with a load, they actually, in order to recover themselves, they produce the steroids that they need, and in males, that's testosterone. But when you're doing eccentric exercise, that actually causes muscle breakdown and destroys the mitochondria. It does cause hypertrophy, right? So you're gonna maybe get bigger muscles, but they're not nearly as strong. And I'm sure you've seen this, like the bodybuilder phenotype. A guy looks really bulky, but there's something off about him, and it's the muscles are disproportionate to the rest of his body. And then when they actually do the actual strength test, the guy with the biggest muscles ended up being much weaker than somebody who looks like Mike Tyson in his prime. The guy didn't look very muscular, but looked like I don't know, like built like a brick. That's really the phenotype you're looking for, and that is achieved by doing concentric exercise. Boxing is one of them. When you hit, you're facing something, you're contracting your muscle to hit something, but then you relax. I'm not saying everybody should get into street fights now, but farm work, lifting weights, trying to do more of the concentric one, avoiding the polyunsaturated fats as much as possible, getting as much sunlight as possible, which activates not only the synthesis of vitamin D, but also the synthesis of testosterone in your skin. The skin is the largest steroidogenic organ, larger than the brain and larger than even the gonads. The skin produces more steroids than probably the other organs combined. And the skin works optimally by supplying sufficient cholesterol, which comes from mostly eating animal products, exposure to sun, right, and of course, good circulation, which comes from decent amount of physical exercise. Again, but not the exhaustive kind where you basically pant yourself to death by running 10 miles, but things like working on the farm, lifting heavy things in an intense fashion for about 20 minutes, and then you do something else.
Yeah. So I think a really easy takeaway from this is that lowering inflammation can lower estrogen activity in the body, and simple ways to do that would be to stop eating PUFAs and to get more sunlight and to lower cortisol however possible. Clean up your diet so you're not just consuming things that are increasing estrogen or endotoxin inside.
Looking at the ingredients that you're putting on your skin for deodorant.
Yeah. If it has more than 5, I would skip on that product.
Yeah. And maybe reducing the amount of polyester that you're wearing and exposure to plastics in the drinks and stuff that you're consuming.
And understanding your current metabolic rate will help you better understand your current resilience and kind of what type of lifestyle activities that are supportive to your health at this point in time, which can change over time.
Yep. Chronic stress, inflammation, and in generally environment that you feel is not pleasant is one of the biggest, is probably the primary sign for your body to decide that it's not a good idea for you to either create or raise children. And until that changes, basically the hormonal environment will not be on your side. The hormonal environment will be geared towards survival, and towards survival, men are not in a very good shape to create or take care of children.
Yeah. So Ashley mentioned fasting really quickly, and I wonder if people are seeing benefits from fasting or eating a lower carb diet because overall they are reducing the inflammation, and then maybe that's coming from endotoxin.
Yeah, exactly.
Side.
Yeah.
And so then they'll actually see less estrogen activity. But we probably should think about using that therapeutically maybe, but then coming out of that and finding ways to improve the metabolism as a more of a long-term solution.
Yeah, so the fasting, which was, I think they started again in the 70s, that showed the extension of the lifespan. Then they started saying, okay, so is it the calories or is it not the calories? And to this day, mass media is trying to make you believe, because they all want us to die, they're trying to make you believe that you're the problem, you should eat less, right, and move more, eat less and move more, right? But it turns out it's not the calories. The multiple studies have demonstrated specific factors in the diet. When you eliminate them or greatly reduce them, they produce the same, if not even higher, lifespan extension than starving yourself half to death. Some of those factors are elimination of the polyunsaturated fats, elimination of the inflammatory amino acids such as methionine, cysteine, and tryptophan, right? Elimination of some of the things that produce endotoxins, such as resistant starches, which unfortunately now are being pushed on down on everybody, saying, well, that's the best thing you can do, but it's going to lower the amount of insulin you produce. Turns out it's not the insulin that's the problem. It's basically the reason you have high insulin is because you have high cortisol. The reason you have high cortisol is because you have high or low chronic grade inflammation, right? And that stems mostly from poor diet, which is inflammatory, endotoxin, and or stress. It's really one cycle of things, and for the people that are really feel like in a vicious cycle and they cannot escape, really the plan should be to escape for a little bit, even for a week, and usually more often than not you'll see a great change, probably to the point where you're going to start seeing where your problems are coming from, and try to we'll have to make some hard decisions on how to avoid these.
I think that like it all comes down to people are so used to living in a stressed out, chronic, inflamed state. And so they need to experience what like a baseline is.
Mm-hmm.
And then be a little bit easier to kind of navigate forward. It's just, honestly, we talk about these things, but it's really hard in practice because our current environment is so crappy. Our food supply is so bad. And so we're not saying any of this is like easy.
Yeah.
It's hard to navigate through this modern time.
We just don't know any better because everything is now engineered almost completely surrounding us by suboptimal things, and we think that's reality. And for many people it is, right? If you never leave the city, if you're the urban type, that is your world. But once you leave and you see that there's a better way, and it revolves doing some different things, then a lot of people are basically look. Almost everybody who comes back from a nice and long and restful vacation hates coming back. Do you think that's a coincidence? I mean, not everybody hates their job, but even the ones that don't hate their job are like, I wish this could last a little bit longer. Why? Because it's healthy for you. It's not just it's not just having fun that's healthy for you, but the change in the scenery and probably the better food and a better landscape and a better environment and potentially even the better people you're around when you're on vacation, that resonates with people, and they don't want to go back to the meat grinder. It's called meat grinder for a reason. It's routine, it's boring, and it's crushing.
I just had the exact opposite experience. So we
Really?
live on a farm.
Oh,
So
yeah, for you.
I went to a farm conference down in Texas, and I had to travel, airplanes, Wi-Fi, EMFs, weird, crappy food. And I just was so excited to get back because I just don't function in normal society. I need to get back to like our farm here where we don't have Wi-Fi. We eat good, and it's just a completely different environment. So I kind of had like the flip experience.
That's how actually life used to be for most people until probably the late 70s. Your home is your castle, or your home is that comes from somewhere. Now, actually, for most people, it turns out to be the other way around. Home is a prison. You need to get out of it in order to realize like how free you can be. But it used to be that home is where you're your optimal self. We need to go back to that. Unless that happens, because home is where you spend most of the time, or at least the home environment is where most of your life revolves around. If that is not optimal, then you cannot expect health to be in a good situation.
Yeah, I think that topic is so deep too, because I think people fail to realize that they can actually be exposed to things like bacteria and endotoxin in high levels from their home, provided that it wasn't maintained properly, or just, maybe there's water damage somewhere. And so it really is you have to take a very holistic approach to recognize what could be your potential problem. If you've done all the dietary changes and you are working on, your exercise routine and lowering stress, and you haven't yet tried Georgie's suggestion of maybe going away for a few weeks and see if you feel better, that might be something to seriously consider. Just considering that a lot of the people that listen to our podcast and that we interact with online are people who have dealt with chronic illness and have tried almost every single thing possible. They've tried every single restrictive diet, they've fasted, they've tried pro-metabolic, and maybe they didn't get a super good response. And it might not be your diet. It might not be your exercise routine. It very well could be something else. So I really like that we kind of came to that at the end of this conversation, to recognize that the environment that we're in is really not set up for us to succeed. And so you do have to be aware of these things. It is scary, but being aware is way better than being ignorant and just going forward without being able to take control of your own health.
I agree. Yeah. Truth may be unpleasant, but it's always better than a pack of lies.
Yep. Very true.
All right. Well, any concluding remarks in terms of improving male fertility?
I think chronic avoidance of sunlight is very detrimental and very common. I posted a study on my blog maybe like 2 years ago that showed that avoidance of sunlight is actually worse than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So think about that. Now, and actually, they compared it. They looked at people who smoked, people who didn't, people who did sunlight, people who didn't, and the ones basically the smokers did better and not by a marginal amount, did better if they spend time a little bit time outside than the non-smokers who are basically avoiding sunlight or applying the sunscreen all the time. The whole thing, the scary stories about melanoma that medicine is trying to tell you, if you actually push your doctor, they will readily admit that the melanomas are probably not sun-related because they almost never appear on a surface that is being hit by the sun. It's always somewhere hidden. It's either like the bottom of your sole of the food, somewhere hidden, like around the pubic area, somewhere, or like on your armpit, or like behind a ear, or someplace, or on the scalp. Some places where basically the sun doesn't really shine much. So it's the sun is not causing the melanomas. Older study, probably the only one that because I try to dig a little bit out, demonstrated that melanoma, just like all the other cancers, is also endocrinologically driven, and it's driven by estrogen. So, unfortunately, and perhaps ironically, most of the sunscreens that are being applied and sold to males and females contain estrogenic endocrine disruptors. And ironically, if you look at the rates of melanoma, they've been steadily rising since the 1970s, again, this crucial decade. And that's when the sunscreen usage really, kind of like took off. Sun exposure has never been lower per capita than it is now. Sunscreen usage has never been higher per capita than it is now, and melanoma rates have never been higher than they are now per capita. So don't be afraid of the sun. Oh, another study showed that even if you get melanoma, if you spend more time in the sun, you're likely to survive it without any treatment than if you actually continue to avoid the sun and do the regular treatments. The UV light in sun does cause, at least increase the risk of the more benign cancers, which are never lethal, and that's the basal cell and the squamous cell carcinomas, which worst case scenario can be easily cut off and almost never spread. So that's really the worst they can expect from an extremely high chronic exposure, which is what even people in the tanning salons very rarely get. And by going to the sun, you're not getting just the UV light, you're getting the red light spectrum, which is very, very beneficial for male fertility specifically. And I'll tell you, some males can try if they want to, but several studies have shown and confirmed in males that basically exposing the testicles to pure red light for about 3 to 4 minutes a day drastically increase both the sperm production and the testosterone levels. In fact, there's a clinical trial now, I think it's in Japan or one Southeast Asia country that has a very big problem with fertility. They're basically it's been negative for a very long time now. The birth rate, I'm sorry, and they've tied it to low male fertility, is now trying to approve this as a male treatment for infertility. Now, I'm not saying you should be bathing your drills in red light. I'm saying you can try it if you want, but it's better for you if you actually go and do whole body exposure to sunlight, maybe even get like bare chested, because the cumulative effect of this larger body area of exposure to sunlight is probably going to be better for you than just shining the red light down there. And actually, it's going to increase testosterone production in your muscles, make you feel better. I don't know of a person who went out in the sun for like a half an hour and did something exciting and did not come back a better person. I do know quite a few people that spend their life mostly inside. They're computer geeks like me, and they don't look very good. All of them are infertile. Not many of them are married or partnered, but the ones that are don't have kids. And they don't have the desire either. And I keep saying, just go out, have some fun in the sun. It's almost like they're afraid of it. It's going to change their life so drastically that they'll feel like they'll have nothing in common with their previous life and they have to make some major changes. But I think that's better than just sitting there and slowly decaying.
Oh, I totally agree. That's a huge component of this too, is finding more of a like-minded community when you're making these shifts. Because if you're surrounded by people who sit inside all day, they're on the computer all the time, or, nothing wrong with computer. Like, everybody works in the computer nowadays. It's just fact. But if you find people who are more willing to go explore these different, more like obscure routes of health, which really shouldn't be seen that way, then maybe you'll be more inclined to stick with it. So I think that's another good suggestion, is to find people who have higher testosterone levels than yourself and hang out with them.
That's it. It will raise your testosterone levels. Yes, it's just an adaptation. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a study. It was about psychology, but then it was an endocrine study that confirmed it. You are the average of the 10 people closest to you in terms of personality. But then they also looked at hormone levels, and turned out that the same is true. Your hormone levels are the average of the 10 women that are around you, right? That are closest to you, not just around you, right? That you spend time with. You do know that females synchronize their periods when they go under the same roof, right? Men do the same, but it happens with testosterone levels.
Yep. My cycle's slowly moving towards our roommates.
Analyze the hormone levels of those at your table.
Yeah, that's
That's
great.
right.
Yeah.
And maybe when you run away, go somewhere sunny.
Oh, I think that I would not. Well, the only reason I would run away to something not sunny if you're basically in a situation where you feel your life has hit a wall. There's nothing else that you could do. You feel there's nothing else you could do that could improve it. Then even if it's a rainy place like the Pacific Northwest, it's probably going to be better because this is forest there. You can go out in nature. Spend some time alone or like with the person that you like and away from civilization and really most of the things that it can offer are not that good for us.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Georgie. Appreciate your insights
Thanks for inviting
as
me.
always. And we will post the links to the studies that Georgie sent us below, and we'll include a link to Georgie's blog where he posts these topics weekly. So make sure, isn't it haidut.me? HAIDUT.me.
Yeah, that's the personal blog, and yeah.
Okay.
Let's see how long it lasts. Twitter is sending me some signs that they may block me, but for the articles, not for my discussions there. But it's okay. The blog is still there.
Wow.
You know you're doing a good thing when you get blocked.
That's true. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Georgie.
So that was a great conversation with Georgie. This is just a recap. So this is Ashley and Sarah now talking separately.
Georgie is always fun to talk to.
Yeah.
He is just an encyclopedia of studies.
He really is. And I know that it's sometimes easy to get lost in all the data and different studies and information, and you kind of are left dumbfounded or a little bit unsure of what to do next in terms of the specific topic of improving your fertility. And we mostly dialed in on male fertility here. So we kind of want to just give our biggest takeaways of what just happened in this podcast and then provide some low-hanging fruits for you to start improving your fertility and overall health today. So what was your biggest takeaway?
So honestly, biggest takeaway is don't settle. There are very obvious reasons why fertility is low, why hormones are low, and there are things you can do about it.
Oh, definitely.
I think that that's my biggest takeaway is like you aren't destined to feel bad. You aren't destined to be infertile. Your body was not designed to that way, and your body can and wants to heal, and there are steps forward.
Definitely. Along the same line though, even if you're not planning on having a child within the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, being aware of the state of your hormonal health and your metabolism is so important, and it goes beyond just being able to have a child, which isn't really somebody's priority when they're in their young 20s or even mid 20s or low 30s if they're still really career driven or they're just not ready for that yet. But setting yourself up for success for when you are ready for it is so helpful and important. And even if you were to just go get some of the blood work that Georgie recommended just to kind of get a grasp on where you are, that really could be a good kick in the butt to kind of start improving some of these areas of your life to be in just overall better health. It's not just about having a child, it's about how healthy and good you feel every single day, how you're functioning, how you're feeling, what you're able to accomplish. It all goes hand in hand. And so I don't like when we approach the topic of fertility just from a standpoint of having a child because it goes so much deeper than that. The state that your body is in, whether it feels safe enough and whether you have all of these different correct levels in balance, is going to impact every other facet of your life. It's not just the ability to have a child. So that's kind of my biggest takeaway is that don't just wait until you and your partner are ready to start trying to make a family. You should probably get this information now and start changing your lifestyle now so you are better prepared in the future.
I think another big takeaway is there's all these restrictive behaviors being pushed in the health sphere. And Sarah and I go back and forth on this, like, ice baths and fasting. And like, Sarah's like,
Let's talk about
Ashley,
it.
like, there's a time and place for these things. And I can see that. But a great point that Georgie brought up is, hey, if your metabolic rate is already low, doing these restrictive things are just going to push your metabolic rate lower, digging you into a deeper stress hole, a deeper like state where you're going to have to dig yourself out eventually. So I think it's really important to assess. Like if you don't know where you're at right now, how do you know if you're moving forward in the future? And so I think taking a week, a month to dedicate to assessing the state of your health, I think that that can be super advantageous and can provide a clear path forward as to what is helping or hurting your health.
Yeah. So those things we're talking about. So the more biohacking type remedies like the cold plunging and maybe even doing a little bit of fasting or whatever you want to call those things. I think that context is so important. So like Ashley said, you should really know where you're at. And if you're somebody who is already under muscled, underweight,
Stressed.
stressed, your first step should not be to go get into a cold plunge. Like that's really not going to move you in the right direction. It might provide like a temporary feeling of euphoria, but it's just not the first step you should take. And so context is important here though, because there are people who do benefit from a lot of these different therapies because maybe it does help overall, you feel better and lower your inflammation. I think everything's really coming down to inflammation. And if some remedy is going to lower your inflammation, you're ultimately going to be better off in that moment. And so that's where we kind of talked about this in the podcast, where some of these things, like, okay, let's say somebody does a 24-hour fast, for example. They've given maybe their gut, enough time to take a break from the elevated endotoxin that might be in their system. Maybe they're having digestive stress. Maybe their diet is really not um, optimal. And so now this fast provided the period of time for the body to kind of lower inflammation. And so if you do this periodically, very with very good intention behind it. So we're not just doing this to lose weight, which we did learn today again that losing weight can be very beneficial for lowering estrogen, lowering inflammation, improving your body composition. But if you were able to use these therapies that you might enjoy in the right time, in the right context, and at a frequency that is actually helping you, not hurting you, I do believe that they can be helpful. But it always comes down to, is that really your low hanging fruit? I don't think anybody has like a cold therapy deficiency. You know what I mean? It's more so like, what state of resilience are you already in? And from there, we can assess like, okay, are you strong enough to handle that? Would that be something that actually does help you build more resilience? Or are you not ready for that kind of stuff and you really need to get your baseline to a better place?
All right, listen, if you enjoy these type of things and it legitimately does make you feel better, no one's telling you to stop. But like you said, it's not a necessary step
Yeah, I mean,
forward.
especially a first step. It's
Yeah.
almost like, hey, you're at a really good place now. Let's go experiment
Yeah.
and see, what can really move the next needle forward for you. Because, like we said, really everything comes down to inflammation. And
Like it's basically like let's create the best internal bodily environment that we can.
yeah. And so if you're going to focus on those things, and I'm just going to say it outright, I like those things. I find that there is cool benefits to using them in a smart way in the overall context of your life. But if you're not simultaneously focusing on every other thing in your life, trying to improve your metabolism, increase energy production, that is probably not a good match. Like you need to kind of do both.
All right, so I'm going to play a would you rather with myself.
Okay.
Would you rather sit in a cold plunge or lay in the grass under sun? I'm going to choose the sun.
Well, yeah, obviously.
I know, but some people make the time for the cold plunge but don't make the time for the sun, you know?
Possibly. But at the same time, like there are people who see drastic, like our friend Morgan, for example, she started doing cold plunges and she saw drastic improvement in her Raynaud's, which is basically a very severe lack of blood flow to your extremities to the point where they start going numb, they turn white. And so Morgan overall though is low inflammation. She is,
Very resilient human
very
being.
resilient, following a good diet, and does so many different things in her life to also move the needle forward. So it's not like a one and done. It's never a one and done. Let's do cold plunge, boom, good, healthy.
Yeah.
So anyway, in the context of what was talked about today, cold plunging is definitely not the first step.
Yeah. You just see these people doing like 24-hour fast, cold plunge. Don't eat until you've done X amount of cardio, like just extremes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so when it comes to dietary extremes, so I think there's a lot of push towards maybe a carnivore diet when it comes to how to improve your testosterone, and I think that there's actually validity there in regards to eating more muscle meat, eating more protein.
And completely flipping your fatty acid profile in your body. When you're eating muscle meat, you are consuming significantly more saturated fats than consuming plant-based proteins, which a lot of them are going to consume PUFA. So
Yeah,
you're literally changing the internal environment of your body by what you're eating.
yeah, and possibly even beyond that, just overall you're lowering your exposure to inflammatory components in foods like gums, different fillers, additives, natural or unnatural flavors, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of benefits from going to a baseline. And I bring this up to say, though, I never really think that that should be somebody's final stop. I think that we can use these different tools therapeutically to get to a better place, in one regard, but then we need to kind of think about what's next and what actually is health. Is health that we cannot ever tolerate any other foods, or is health that we got ourselves to a good place to where we can start, adding in different foods and our body is in the place to digest them, to assimilate the nutrients and to become more resilient. So the reason I bring that up is because I know that things, when we become afraid and we hear all this information, sometimes we go to that radical, huge shift, elimination in our life and our diet. And while I do think, like I said, there is some validity to that, I do always caution somebody to have, a more broad and inclusive end goal in mind, and not just get stuck in this continuous, just continuous exposure and domino effect of more and more and more extreme and more elimination because you felt good. Because you always need to remember that your body thrives in abundance, and it thrives with, having challenges here and there, but overall having a sense of safety. And the way to foster that is to not encourage extreme restriction and feeling like you can't tolerate all these different things. Because if that's the case, then there is something deeper going on. It's not you. It's not that your body was uniquely made to just tolerate fruit or just tolerate meat. It's something else going on. And so that's kind of why we like to talk about all these different facets of, diet, lifestyle, nutrition, exercise, environment. Or nutrition and diet is the same thing, but because there are connections between them all, and we have to look at the whole picture, especially when we're dealing with chronic illness.
Ultimately, measure your body temperature and pulse and your free T3 levels and maybe cholesterol.
No, to get the whole blood work
Get
panel Georgie
the
mentioned,
Yeah,
especially
and
most
if
people are listening to this for male fertility.
yes, get the cortisol, DHEA, testosterone, total
Prolactin,
testosterone, prolactin, and then
estrogen.
also measure your body temperature and pulse measurements. Like if you're chronically in the 96s, we need to get that up. And analyzing these metabolic parameters can help you gauge whether a certain activity, nutrition change, lifestyle change, uh, whatever change you make, whether it's moving you in the right direction. But I think it's always important to consider that these things take time. And
Yeah.
so it's frequent analyzing, and it's after a period of time. It's not just one day,
Yeah.
2 days.
So we're going to go into some low hanging fruits to tackle. And I just want to say that Ashley and I disagree on some things sometimes. And so it's fun to openly talk about it where we're recording it, because I think maybe it's going to be useful to somebody who's having the same disagreements in their head. They're like, oh, but so and so said this, but I feel this, but this and this.
I just get jaded by restrictions sometimes,
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's just,
I
I
hear
guess,
that.
just my
But you also have to recognize that people are struggling. And sometimes a baseline in a very simple diet can be helpful just to clear the noise while they figure out what to do. It's Ray Pete's um, think,
no
perceive,
doubt,
act, or
no
perceive.
doubt, no doubt.
Yeah, we have to kind of simplify things for ourselves so we can think good enough to take the next step. And so, um, anyways, some of the low hanging fruits, like you just mentioned, would be get your blood work.
Get your blood work and reduce. Like the easiest thing is to stop using chemicals on your skin. Like I think that's just like that is an activity that you can eliminate now.
Yeah, this applies to both males and females. I think there was a really disgusting statistic that females use some horrific amount of endocrine disrupting chemicals on their skin every single day just from their makeup routine. So moving towards cleaner products, so that would be deodorants, body washes, shampoos, conditioners, um, toothpaste, all these different things.
And then reducing your PUFA consumption, polyunsaturated fatty acids. Like literally, the food you eat becomes it forms the structures inside of you. And fats have a really long half life, like years.
Yeah,
And so any fats that are stored from your diet are literally impacting the internal environment of your body. And so I think that that's another low hanging fruit. Like cut out the excessive nuts and seeds. If you enjoy those, have them
you can
on
also
occasion.
make them more
Properly
digestible.
prepare them. Yeah, Weston A. Price principles. But like cook with butter, tallow, and ghee.
Yeah, maybe
Simple things like that.
maybe stop going out to eat as much. Maybe cooking your own meals is a good idea.
Learning how to make food is like step one.
I think that's a flex. I think that is something.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So, well, I'm not into. I don't know.
Is that a
the
hip
lingo.
term?
I think
That's a flex?
I would say that a flex is something that's like okay, so think about it when like you've got muscles, you're flexing on somebody. That's like, that's like, dang, look at that. So to me, cooking your own meals and knowing how to cook is a flex. It's something that I find very attractive. It's something that draws me to this person because I'm like, yeah, like let's go.
So would that be similar to like the term based? That's based?
Um,
I don't know. Okay.
I honestly don't know.
Just like I think it's so opposite of mainstream. Like mainstream is so like quick, convenient, packaged food, going out to eat.
Mhm.
And because food is somehow inconvenient,
Yeah.
like it's like oh my God, I have to make my food today. Like, what? That's my favorite part of the day.
I know. I mean, it can be daunting, but
Yeah.
that's why being simple helps. Don't overthink it. Pick a protein, pick a fat, pick a carb. Boom.
Done.
Another flex to me is like knowing where your food comes from.
Yeah.
So
I think with those two first steps, stopping your like toxic exposure and cooking your foods, I think that those are like for me the two lowest hanging fruits.
Definitely. And just think about it this way, that when you lower inflammation, you are lowering the amount of enzymes that inhibit your liver to detoxify estrogen. And so that's where I feel like this is like just a huge component of inflammation and estrogen is when we have high inflammation, we actually are storing more estrogen. We have higher estrogen activity. It's making everything harder. So if we can figure out how to lower inflammation, I feel like the lowest hanging fruit for that is what you're putting inside your body on a regular basis, your diet. And so, yeah, like Ashley said, lowering PUFA consumption is definitely the first start. And then I wouldn't even go beyond that for diet right now. I feel like there's so many other things you can do first in your lifestyle, in your environment, that will move the needle forward a little bit more. So another thing for me would be, if you're in a good enough health state, is to start focusing on building muscle and not cardio. So prioritizing strength training. In your environment, I would say that you need to kind of assess whether you're living in a clean environment. Maybe getting an air filter would be a good move. Lowering your exposure to molds and bacteria in your environment is a really good idea.
Stop watching so much news, because that is
Yeah.
just like directly stress going into your body. Like that is something that you can reduce. I love like low hanging fruits that are things that you can stop doing, right? Because that's easier. That's an easier action item, is to stop doing something than to add another thing to your busy schedule. And so like calling friends or talking to your community or doing something that will make you laugh is going to improve the internal state of your body more so than watching like hours and hours of news. Of course, it's important to stay informed as to what's happening, but like chronic news watching, especially given the state of the current world, like that is just a direct, like your body is saying, okay, I'm just going to increase cortisol levels in my body.
Oh, definitely. So lower stress and get more sun. So be outside more. Make sure you're getting enough vitamin D. Yeah, I feel like that's a really good start.
And I feel like those are like the paramount things to nail down, really master, before you can start getting lost in the weeds of minute details that aren't important.
Yeah, and also before you start getting lost in like, what supplement should I take? It's like, let's not jump to supplements until we've optimized everything else. And I fully believe there's a time and place for supplements. So I'm not saying don't take supplements, but let's do everything else first and then see where we're at. So,
all right, this is the end of the Strong.Sistas wrap up.
Almost 20-minute ramble.
Until next time, stay rooted in resilience.